So this is our next to the last class. We have one more class next week. And next week, I remind you, I won't make any presentation whatsoever. We're going to reserve the entire class for open conversation for as long as you like. And I would like you to come all equipped with questions and comments about general themes in the argument of the course, most naturally perhaps related to the papers you will be writing. Today, I want to devote this class to the two most important intellectual foundations of an argument like the one that I have been developing here. I addressed this earlier in the course, and now I'm coming back to it, repeating and developing what I said before. Those two foundations are first the theory of regime, or of structure, the view of structural change, structural discontinuity, structural alternatives. The explanation of structures and of structural change is the supreme object of ambition in social theory. And the preservation or transformation of the established structure, the established institutional arrangements, and the ideological assumptions with which they are associated is the supreme object of ambition in practical politics. So this is a theme which cannot be avoided, which makes it all the stranger, more remarkable, that contemporary social science somehow manages to avoid it, as I will soon say. The second foundation of the argument has to do with the direction, the normative direction, the vision, the prescriptive vision of where to go, of where we should go, where we can go. So let me begin with the theory of regimes. The theory of regimes, as I have said, is the main element, the main current in the evolution of social and political thought. Its antecedents go back at least to Aristotle, and then in the modern era to Montesquieu and Marx. All of them had views of the basic structure of social life and the way in which it shapes the surface routines and is, in a sense, the fate of society. So the institutional options that are available to us are that fate, and if we want to rebel against that fate, to enlarge it, the only way to do it is to enrich our understanding of the structures and enlarge our imagination of what they can become. Now, in the whole of contemporary thought, of social science and policy discourse, we find in every corner, in every direction, a systematic evasion of the imperative of structural vision. So first, in the positive social sciences, of which economics is the most influential and the best organized, we see the predominance of the rationalizing impulse, the attempt to represent the arrangements of society as the expression of functional necessities, or as the outcome of a narrowing funnel of evolution toward best available practice and the best possible institutions. But each social science does this in a different way. So if we think of the social sciences as if they were families, we can apply Tolstoy's lesson at the beginning of Anna Karenina that all happy families are alike, but each happy family is unhappy in its own way. And the unhappiness of each of the social sciences lies in its particular way of evading the imperative of structural vision. In the normative disciplines of political philosophy and legal thought, what we find are forms of idealization, pseudo-philosophical props to the ameliorative practices of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy, or the idealization of law in the language of impersonal principle and policy responsive to the public interest. So, for example, the theories of justice that are influential in the Anglo-American world have as their characteristic object the justification of retrospective redistribution through tax and transfer. That is to say, progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. They combine an egalitarian profession of faith with institutional skepticism or agnosticism. And if you add up this combination of those two factors, the institutional conservatism or agnosticism and the egalitarian commitment, the residue, the practical residue of that sum is then the justification of the compensatory redistribution. In other words, the market is a wonderful engine for the creation of wealth. Unfortunately, it generates inequality. Our main concern is to diminish inequality. We diminish it by fixing the outcomes generated in the market. And I've already argued at several points in the course that this effort at corrective redistribution is necessarily very limited in its efficacy. Its greatest practical achievement, as exemplified by European social democracy, is the preservation of a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities. And in law, we have the representation of law after 19th century doctrinal formalism in the language of impersonal principles of right and policies responsive to the collective interest. An idealization of law in this language of principle and policy, which is supposed to be justified by the idea that if we attempt to put the best face on the law and describe this best face in the language of policy and principle, we will improve the law over time in the process of applying it, especially to the benefit of the groups that are most likely to have lost out in the politics that produced the lawmaking in the first place. So corrective redistribution and legal idealization are then the two main instruments and activities of these forms of evasion of structure in the normative disciplines of political philosophy and legal theory. And in the humanities, we then have, we find consciousness embarking on a roller coaster of subjective adventurism, dissociated from the reimagination and remaking of society. The historical background to this in the humanities was the fateful parting of the ways between modernism and leftism in the first half of the 20th century. So these are the three dominant tendencies across the whole field of social and historical studies: rationalization, humanization, and escapism. The adepts of these three tendencies pretend to be antagonists, but in fact they are allies in the disarmament of the transformative will and the transformative imagination. The claim I've made repeatedly at different moments in the semester has been that to understand anything is to imagine its transformative possibilities in the realm of the adjacent possible. That's how we understand anything. Anything in nature or anything in society. If we don't understand what it can next become, we don't understand it altogether. We simply rationalize it. We dress it up with a retrospective halo of rationalizing mystification. So the need to overcome this evasion of structural vision, which is the curse of contemporary social science, of the normative disciplines, and of the humanities, then leads us to confront the theory of regimes, which is the theory of structure, and to try and understand its basic problems and what we can make of it now. Now let me restate the history of the theory of regimes in the West, in Europe, in a nutshell. So, in classical European social theory, the culmination of thinking about the theory of regimes was Karl Marx's theory of society and history. And Marx labeled the regimes the modes of production. And he had a revolutionary insight. The revolutionary insight was that these structures are our creation, that they are artifacts, that they are what in an earlier class I call frozen fighting. So there's an ongoing struggle in history over the terms of our access to one another. This struggle is temporarily interrupted and partially contained, and the crystallized residue of the partial interruptions and the relative containments are the structures. So the fighting is always there when the struggle is interrupted or contained, but there in some lower contained or latent form. And then it periodically erupts in moments of revolutionary change. That was Marx's idea. And the idea then is connected with the concept of reification. We made the structures, but then when the fact that we made them, that they are us, that they are the frozen version of our struggles with one another, ceases to be present to our minds in these long interludes of quiescence. They acquire a mendacious semblance of naturalness and necessity. We can understand them, as Vico had already suggested in the 18th century, because we made them. And therefore we can have the hope of understanding the structures in a way in which we could never hope to understand a natural object, a phenomenon in nature, because they are us. And that's then the basis of this idea of reification. Now, this revolutionary insight in Marx's theory of society and history was circumscribed and to some extent eviscerated by what you could call the illusions of false necessity. And there are three principal illusions of this kind in Marx's theory of society and history. The first is the closed list illusion. There is a predetermined set of the possible regimes in Marxist theory, the modes of production, a closed elenchus. And history selects from that closed list. Its content is already predetermined. Slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. The second illusion is the indivisibility illusion. Each of these regimes is an indivisible system. If it changes all at once. And from the closed list, from the indivisibility illusion, there results a momentous practical consequence. The consequence is the binary idea of politics. Politics is of two kinds. Either it is the reformist management of a regime, an indivisible system, or it is the revolutionary substitution of one regime by another. And I mentioned in an earlier class in the semester that the practical significance of this second illusion is to serve as an alibi for its opposite. That is, because we think real change, fundamental change, would be revolutionary change, if revolutionary change is not accessible to us, or if, although accessible, it seems to be too dangerous, then we say what we can do, what remains to do, is to humanize the existing world. And then we have the fundamental justification of institutionally conservative social democracy or social liberalism. The third illusion of false necessity is the historical laws illusion. The illusion that there are laws governing not just the operation of each of these regimes, the laws of the recurrent cycles of capitalism, for example, that Marx claims to describe in his masterwork, Das Kapital. But there are laws governing the foreordained succession of these indivisible systems in history. And if there are these laws, then strictly speaking, there is no role for programmatic thought. History has a program for us to imagine that we can invent a program and then enact it is a kind of undisciplined voluntarism. Now, what has happened in the subsequent evolution of this idea in classical social theory, this Marxist idea of structure and structural change, is that it has lost credibility in the light of historical learning, but also practical political experience. So very few people in the world now believe in its strict heroic assumptions, but they continue to use its vocabulary. So the words are used even though the theoretical context that gave them meaning is no longer an object of belief. And this helps explain the enormous confusion in contemporary programmatic discourse, and especially in the discourse of the left. So the concepts of class conflict or capitalism, the idea of capitalism as a system and of its laws, this is all part of the common parlance. But the meaning of those words has no strict boundaries once they have lost their moorings in this theoretical system. The way in which, on the whole, Marxism has been reformed in the world has been by dilution, that is, emphasizing the relative autonomy of both politics and consciousness or culture from these underlying structures and their progression. So it's maintaining the basic system but watering it down, rather than rescuing the central revolutionary insight and trying to extricate it from the stranglehold of those illusions of false necessity. And the result is the situation that we observe in the contemporary social sciences, in which their retrospective rationalization no longer faces an effective challenge because the main enemy has been watered down rather than reinvented. So a simple account of what's happened in the history of modern social science is that it has disposed of the illusions of false necessity only by also abdicating the original revolutionary insight. So these illusions don't apply because the central idea that the structures were made by us, that we can recreate them, that they are not eternal, that they don't correspond to natural necessity, has lost its practical significance. And only because the central insight has been abandoned do the surrounding illusions of false necessity, are the surrounding illusions of false necessity discarded. That's a very simple account of what's happened. And what would one need? Now, remember at the beginning of the course, I presented that account of the characteristic dilemma of contemporary programmatic argument. I present to you a view that's far away from what exists. You say, that's interesting, but it's utopian. I present something close to what exists. You say, that's feasible, but it's trivial. And then I said, in the current climate of opinion, almost anything that can be proposed is likely to be dismissed as either utopian or trivial. And I said then, this false dilemma arises from a misunderstanding of the nature of a programmatic argument or of transformative practice. It's not about blueprints, it's about successions of steps. It's about trajectories. It's not like architecture, it's like music. And any succession that is worth thinking about can be described at points that are relatively close to what exists or relatively far from what exists. But that false dilemma and this false analogy to blueprints rather than successions has been enormously aggravated by a contingent feature in the evolution of ideas. And that is that we don't now have a usable and credible way of thinking and talking about structural alternatives and structural change. Because of this failure of the theory, of the classical theory of structure in European social theory. And as a result, we fall back on a fake criterion of political realism, which is that a proposal is realistic to the extent that it is close to what already exists. That is the fundamental theoretical explanation for this false dilemma. So we need a theory of structure, or at least an implicit theory of structure, or a proto-theory of structure, in order to have powerful programmatic arguments. Arguments about alternative structures, about structural change. And the characteristic form of structural change, once we reject the binary view of politics, is what I called radical reform. That is, change that is structural. It is change in the institutional arrangements of the market order, of democratic politics, or of independent civil society, but it is piecemeal. And although fragmentary, it can nevertheless be cumulative if it continues in a certain direction. So what is a way of thinking about structure that can inform a programmatic argument conducted in that spirit? And what I'm now going to do is simply to outline some of the basic attributes of such a theory, the theory that we would need, the way of thinking, and therefore the way of arguing. I'm not going to outline an actual social theory, although that to me is a subject of great interest. I'm simply going to sketch in the most general way what we would want of it. So first, the first attribute that it has to have is it has to do justice to the way in which, in a structure, in an institutional order, and in its associated ideological assumptions, all the parts tend to reinforce each other. There are interdependencies among the parts. But although they reinforce one another, they are not a system which has to be changed all at once or not at all. They're not there on a take it or leave it basis. And when they change, they characteristically change piece by piece and step by step. And that leads to the idea that the exemplary form of structural change is piecemeal change. So that's the first attribute that the theory of structure we need would have to have. The second characteristic is that it must do justice to the relation between functional imperatives or functional advantages and institutional arrangements. One structure prevails over another in the battle over alternative structures because it's able to serve as the basis for the achievement of certain advantages. Economic growth or prosperity, political power, cultural authority, but any given level of advantage can always be supported by alternative sets of institutional arrangements. In other words, there's not a one-to-one relation between a particular institutional order and its functional consequences. There is a powerful element of functional explanation in history. We can't understand the invention and diffusion of certain structures without taking into account the functional advantages that they make possible for the societies that adopt them. That's the functional element. But this element of functional advantage, this association between the structures and the advantages that they enable, has this attribute of indeterminacy or plurality that I described. The same level of advantage can characteristically be achieved by alternative sets of institutional arrangements. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to explain what has happened in the contemporary world. States that are organized as they are in the North Atlantic world, and states as they are organized in Northeast Asia and in China, now can have high levels of economic prosperity, political power, military power, and even the capacity to attract ideologically, even though they are organized in radically different ways. So we have to take into account both things: the relation of institutions to functional advantages and disadvantages, and the complication of indeterminacy or plurality. And this idea is associated with another conception that has recurred in the arguments of the course. And that's the conception of the path of least resistance. When there is an innovation in the world, whether it is conceptual, technological, organizational, or institutional, the tendency is to adopt that innovation in the form that is least subversive to the ruling interest and the established preconceptions. And that's what I'm calling the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance is always the most probable outcome, but it's not the necessary outcome. There is always an alternative to the path of least resistance. The advantage of the path of least resistance is that it requires less disruption, less disturbance to the established order of society, but its disadvantage is that it characteristically shortchanges the potential of the innovations. And that's what the enemies of the path of least resistance have on their side. So the insular knowledge economy, which has been one of the main objects of discussion in the course, is a characteristic example of the path of least resistance. It is a downsizing of the potential of the knowledge economy to accommodate the knowledge economy to the realities of class society. But as a result of this downsizing, of this accommodation, it fails adequately to exploit the potential of the knowledge economy. So those deeper features that it promises to have to bring closer together production and imagination, to increase the level of reciprocal trust and discretionary initiative allowed and required of all participants in the process of production, and to annul or even reverse what has been the most universal constraint in economic life, the constraint of diminishing marginal returns to inputs in production. All of that higher promise is limited or denied by the path of least resistance. Only a knowledge economy for the many would be able to seize on that potential. Now, the third attribute which the theory of structure that we need would have to have is that we'd have to account for a feature of our theory of society that has no adequate counterpart in our understanding of nature. And that is that the structures of society, unlike natural structures, don't either exist or not exist. They exist more or less. They have a variability of entrenchment. A structure of society can be organized practically and ideologically to entrench itself against challenge, against resistance, or on the contrary, to open itself up to revision and challenge and change. And that is this variation, this variability in the character of entrenchment or disentrenchment, which the structures of society possess, but the structures of nature do not. And this is of great significance to us because of its many practical consequences. So I mentioned in another context in the arguments of the course that both the liberals and the socialists in the early 19th century believed that there was a natural convergence or a predetermined harmony between the institutional arrangements that are the necessary conditions for economic growth, for our ability to lessen the burdens of poverty, infirmity, and drudgery, and the institutional conditions that can emancipate us from entrenched schemes of social division and hierarchy. In other words, they believe that the same politics, the same institutional arrangements that delivered prosperity and practical power would also deliver emancipation. Now, we're unable to believe in that pre-established harmony between our practical and moral objectives. And we are therefore threatened with converting to a belief in the opposite dogma, that there is some tragic conflict between the institutional conditions of emancipation and the institutional conditions of prosperity and power. The truth is that the institutional conditions of these two sets of goods have an area of potential overlap. And one way to define what our thinking must seek to do is to describe that area of overlap. That is, there is some subset of the conditions of economic growth and practical power that also serves our conditions of emancipation, that serves the goal of emancipation. And some subset of the conditions of emancipation that serves the goal of practical power and prosperity. And a characteristic of the arrangements in the area of overlap, in the area where these institutional conditions overlap, seems to be that they both have an experimentalist character. That is, they allow for more combination or recombination or invention. That's the basis for the subversion of the class hierarchies, and it's also the basis for the development of our practical powers. And that observation would then help explain what I have claimed to be a unique feature of our historical circumstance. That like the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we have reason to recognize the primacy of structural changes over mere reallocations of resources and rights. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, all of whose sects believed that there was some definitive fix to the problems of emancipation and of prosperity, we have reason to resist entrusting the future of society to an institutional fetish, to a dogmatic formula, to a blueprint. And one of the most important qualities that our institutional arrangements in politics or in the economy must have is that they invite their own revision in the light of experience, that they facilitate and organize an experimentation, an ongoing experimentation over the future. So those three sets of attributes, to my mind, although they're far from establishing the content of a theory of structure, they at least describe the intellectual space in which we should seek to develop a theory of structure that would be an adequate basis for our programmatic thinking. Now, the theory of structure that I've just attempted to sketch in turn informs our ideas about agency, about how to think about the alliances, the social alliances and the political alliances that can sustain such programmatic alternatives. And the view of agency implied by these arguments is in stark opposition to the Marxist view of agency. So the Marxist view of agency supposes that as class conflict expands in scope and increases in intensity, the objective content of the interests of each class becomes more perspicuous. So it's only the failure of class conflict to occur which then invites confusion over class interests. But as class conflict becomes more severe, the content of the class interest becomes apparent. Now this, I want to say, is the exact opposite of the truth. As class conflict or group conflict in society increases in intensity and expands in scope, the question, what are my interests as a member of a certain class, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the alternatives? And who would I be, and what would my interests become under these alternatives? So in other words, the impression that the interests of a class are self-evident is a consequence of the absence of this struggle over alternatives. As the struggle over alternatives increases, the false objectivity of the class interest diminishes. So implicit in this view then are two ideas. The first idea is that every programmatic proposal has as its reverse side a conception of agency, of alliances, of coalitions among social and among political forces. It's not just that the idea of agency is an afterthought, that you have a programmatic proposal and then you address the question, who will implement it? Rather, your idea of its base or of the base that it would need or that it would develop is just another way of stating it. So every programmatic proposal can be developed in these two corresponding discourses, a discourse about its doctrinal content, its institutional and ideological substance, and a discourse about its social base and the view of their interests and identities that would result. And I applied this idea then by developing this conception of the duality of ways of understanding and defending group interests or class interests. For any given understanding of a class interest or group interest, there is a way of defining and defending it that is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive, and another way of defining and defending it that is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. So the canonical example of this idea, then, is how you approach the interests of what has been the core historical constituency of the progressive parties, the left-leaning parties in the West, which is organized labor headquartered in the capital-intensive parts of the economy. Is it their interest to dig into their present niche in the established division of labor, their present niche in the so-called Rust Belt industries, in conventional industry, and therefore to oppose all the groups that threaten that position, the temporary workers, the foreign workers, the small business class, etc.? Or is it their interest to convert conventional industry into a variant of the knowledge economy, in which case the groups that they used to think of as their antagonists must become their allies? But I think the more important example of the application of this thesis would be with respect to the constituency that I've also claimed in earlier classes to be now decisive in the world. And that's what I call the subjective petty bourgeoisie. So remember what the claim was. The claim was that in most countries in the world, the great majority of people are poor. If not absolutely poor, then relatively poor. They are poor and disorganized. But their horizon of aspiration is petty bourgeois. They aspire to a modest prosperity and independence. In the absence of other conceptions of how that aspiration is to be achieved, they are then wedded to the ambition of traditional, archaic, regressive family business, a small plot of land, a small store, etc. And to the spiritual counterparts to those material ambitions, materialism, individualism, and consumerism. So that would then be an example of the institutionally conservative and socially exclusive way of understanding their interests. They think of themselves as a small business class in the making, and they then define as their enemies all the groups that would threaten the achievement of that aspiration. But to the extent that they came to think that the achievement of their aspiration depended on overcoming its conventional form, on finding other ways to fulfill this desire for modest prosperity and independence, their way of defining and defending their interests would become institutionally transformative, and it would have to be socially solidaristic because it would have to go beyond the limits of this small business class and extend to the vast majority of the people. So it is this subjective petty bourgeoisie which now in the world is the most plausible carrier of the universal interests of humanity, which Karl Marx said was represented by the industrial proletariat. The group that he described as the industrial proletariat is now in every country in the world, rich or poor, a minority, a shrinking minority, which comes to see itself and is seen by all the other groups in society as one more special interest, rather than as the carrier of the universal interest of humanity. So you can see that this discussion of the theory of regimes, although it appears at the outset to pose a merely theoretical question, in fact ends up having implications that are of the greatest practical urgency. So this is what I wanted to say about the theory of regimes, and now I'm open to your questions and comments before I go on to the second part of the argument about the direction. So a conservative doesn't have to have a way of thinking, right? If he's some kind of historicist or traditional. He doesn't need to have a theory. But a leftist does. Yes, I'll come to you. A leftist does, and that's why I'm insisting on this question. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. My question is, when we are imagining the immediate next to the relative to the existing one,
Yes.
In the process, where ideological formations as well as the structural formations and imaginations all are created parallelly by the class or group of people who necessarily would want a structural change over an individualistic change.
Yes.
At the same time, there are parallel processes which are going on, which will necessarily go on. You know, the moment this starts, there is an equal counter which keeps coming on.
Yes.
Yeah, and that could be in form of a very minority of a radical support that this particular group may get, but usually it is in form of a manufactured ignorance which is created in volume, and also there are many manipulations which are created, and the kind of a threat that is taken by even the most basic formulations of change, and then a counterintuitive theories which are proclaimed. So all of this, when it is occurring, how do you envision that there could be any possibility of having a crack and some change occurring through that?
I'm not sure I understand. So,
So-
are you saying that in the actual transition
Yes,
from one thing to another, conflict erupts,
yes.
which you can't control? Is that the point?
So the conflict erupts, but then whereas you see a transformation happening, even though step by step, but then it is when it is overcome by a very high voluminous manufactured ignorance, or a counterintuitive deference, or total countering of the effect, then there can be the possibility of the change that you are talking about, even gradual or step by step.
Yes, but so it's not just one myth against another myth, because the alternatives either deliver or don't deliver some advance in these practical realities. There is an association of the institutional alternatives to what I call these functional imperatives of power, including military power and economic power. And so it's not as if it were simply a game of symbolic manipulation of one path against another. Some work and others don't, or work less good, less well. And so that imparts a direction. And then on this view that I've stated, the task of the progressive is to come to this majority, this subjective petty bourgeoisie, and offer it a different way of achieving its aims, other than that way in which, by default, they've sought to progress. That's the argument. But it's not as if we have as if there were laid out for us a scheme which guaranteed success. So one of the reasons why Marxism has been so successful, not just as a social theory but as a political rhetoric, is that it appears to tell the revolutionaries, the enemies of the established order, that history is on their side. So it arouses the heroic will, the will to transformation, the will to struggle, and it says, the odds against you seem to be overwhelming, but you have an ally. Your ally is history. So it's a way of arousing the will to resistance by promising that history is on their side. The problem is the cost of illusion that is paid, and this illusion then has practical consequences in the organization of social life. So in the 20th century, the left demonized the petty bourgeoisie, which it viewed as the enemy. Then the petty bourgeoisie became the mainstay of the right-wing movements. So the theoretical narrative was not innocent. It had practical consequences. No, I think that there is a problem in the way that I've conducted this discussion, which is I'm raising the stakes, right? As I say, I'm doubling the bet. And I'm saying programmatic discourse depends on the theory of regimes. Radical reform has to be associated with the imagination of structural change. But who is going to do that in the real world, right? In which there's a world of struggle and then there's this world of ideas. And the claim is that they're going to be married in some way. Now, in this respect, Marx's example is very dangerous because Marx sat alone in the reading room of the British Museum for thousands of nights and produced this work, this theory, right? In the first 20 years after Das Kapital was published, it sold 200 copies. It seemed that no one had read it. Then a few more generations passed and the world was on fire in the name of these ideas. So that's like a magical thing, right? Which then inspires in the intelligentsia this idea that there's some fantastic button that they can press and that will seem at first to have no effect, but then 50 years later will produce an explosion. Well, that's not plausible. So I would like to hear you on this. So we have after all this idea that politics is one practical problem after another. That's like the European Union or the Kennedy School, right? There's a grab bag of technical problems. You solve them one by one. Politics is the realm of advances in marginal gains in equity and in efficiency. Politics is not the realm of the sublime. The sublime is privatized. Religion, art, vision is encased within the individual conscience. So that's now in the United States, that's certainly the dominant culture, the dominant view. It wasn't the view of the left, of the liberals, of the socialists in the 19th century. Their objective was not the humanization of society, it was the divinization of humanity. And they believed you had to have a comprehensive view of history. Now, I think you, in a sense, you do need to have a comprehensive view of history. Not in the way that they thought, but in some other way. And that this legacy of classical social theory has to be rekindled, it has to be carried on, but reinvented. But this is a very tall order, because how is the lightning of thought to strike the forest, the ground of society, as Karl Marx promised that it would? And as it seems that in a sense it has, though not in the way that he wanted. So, in other words, I've been very frank in stating the ambition, the combination of theoretical and practical ambition that animates this project. But I recognize that it's against all appearance of what is plausible or likely in the world, given what things seem to be now. So I want to hear you about this. What do you think? No one will speak? So you know there are a bunch of disciplines in the world which are supposed to prevent this. So one of them is economics. So the economics that was created by marginalism has its defects, but it has one of the things that it's supposed to do, even in the eyes of its most acerbic critics, is to present the bill to the dreamer It says there's no free lunch. We have a science of trade-offs and constraints. Here are all these dreams. Now pay for them. Yes.
So it sounds like you're just asking for our general reactions to what you've laid out so far. Is that accurate?
It sounds that what?
You are wanting our reactions so far to what you just said?
Yeah, but I'm trying to focus on a particular aspect of this, which is this combination of high theoretical and practical ambition. So I think that in the current situation, taking out the United States today, here, where we stand, high theoretical ambition can be forgiven in certain contexts, and high practical ambition can also be forgiven. But what seems unforgivable is their combination. And their combination was precisely what characterized these great moments in the development of thought, of radical thought in the West. Karl Marx, classical liberalism, and so forth. That they didn't think they were just theorizing. They thought they were showing the way to the transformation of humanity. And that the highest theoretical ambition was associated with transformative power. Now that's what seems very hard for us to believe. Or tell me if I'm wrong. So everyone here is in some sense a witness to this circumstance. There's no privileged knowledge about this fact. So what do you think?
Well, I think what I'm sitting with is what I see at least very present in this country, which I think, to your question, in my view, prevents the imagination or the acceptance of this high theoretical and practical ambition for the way forward of accepting that. And to me, that's paradoxically the middle class, who, with technology and enough capital.
No, I'm sorry, what do you mean by the middle class?
I guess it's a good question of how we define it, but I would say it's the subset of society who has enough to live on such that they're comfortable.
Because,
so
you know, the United States is, among the North Atlantic democracies, is the one with the most hierarchical, most well-defined class structure. But the one that is, among the North Atlantic democracies, the one that is least inclined to recognize itself as a class society. And one of the ways in which it denies its class character is through this category of the middle class. So I don't know what a middle class person is, but the Americans all seem to know. So my understanding of what it means to be middle class in the United States is that middle class is a worker with a bourgeois identity. So in other words, he's a member of the working class. The working class has two parts. Now, a middle class presumably also includes the small business class. So it's not just the working class, it's the small business class. But the implication seems to be everyone who is not part of the tiny plutocracy at the top and is not part of the racially stigmatized underclass is this middle class. So the middle class is just, the middle class is a way of designating the existence of the people in a classless society. That seems to be what it means. But why were you using it now in this context, and for what purpose?
I think I come back a little bit to your delineation a few classes ago on the definition of freedom and the contradictions inherent in that freedom. And something I'm sitting with is sort of this the philosophy that has existed in the U.S. around this, hyper individualistic mentality, and when it comes to wide scale, high theoretical and practical structural change, I think most people, like in my head, the hardest thing to break through is the class that's just comfortable and doesn't really want change. How do you break through?
Who doesn't really want what? Say that again.
The percentage of people in this country who have enough such that they're comfortable. They might have some agitation with the system, but not enough to really raise the heat such that they feel compelled to take to the streets or compelled to show up at the polls. How do you get that segment of society to, I guess, either feel more agitation or be excited about the prospect of wide-scale change?
Well, it's a puzzle, isn't it? Because even the ones who are materially benefited seem to feel oppressed. So, for example, here we are at the Harvard Law School. And are you a law student yourself or not? Okay. So a large part of the law class is heavily indebted, and then they feel they need to go work for these law firms, where they're paid huge amounts of money. They get very high salaries. They're miserable at these law firms. So they do terrible work, routine work. It's thought work, so they're not manual laborers. But they feel really enserfed, and they're paying off these debts. And they're part of, they're aspirants to inclusion in the American professional and business class. So the experience of being oppressed is not just the experience of the young black men incarcerated in the American prisons. It's an experience which is very widespread in the society. And so I'm giving the example of elite law students working for big law. They also feel oppressed. But so the idea that there's one narrow segment of society, the industrial proletariat, which bears this universal burden of oppression, doesn't correspond to the reality. Now, I
think that's true, but I also think you see that in the big tech
yes.
firms as well. But when it comes to going to vote, when it comes to
I understand
receiving these very ambitious institutional reforms,
I understand. So then we have an empirical question. We spoke about this in the discussion of high energy democracy. So there's supposed to be a series of features that are intrinsic to American political culture, like depoliticization, accommodation, and so forth. But now I say this: give me a rule of mandatory voting in the United States, as many democracies have, rich and poor. Give me a prohibition of selling television time. Give me free access to the means of mass communication. Give me a series of innovations in the electoral regimes. America would become very politicized. And so things that are attributed to culture are, to a very great extent, the consequences of practical arrangements. Now the question is how you inspire transformation of those arrangements. The United States is at an extreme of a spectrum with respect to this, because I, of course, haven't been addressing here the situation in the United States. I've been thinking of the world. But I don't think that it's as different from the rest of the world as it seems to be, or as the Americans may think it is. and that all of these circumstances that we've been discussing and exploring here have counterparts in the United States. So let's take two examples of the American situation. So first, in religion, because after all, this is a very important part of the United States. There's there are three main religious tendencies in the United States. There's the Orthodox Christian churches. There's the secular humanism, which to a very large extent is a secularization of conventional Christian piety. And then there's a distinctive element in American religious experience, which some people have called the American religion, which is represented by the religions that the Americans invented, like Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. The central idea of the American religion is that the individual isn't just in communion with God, the individual is God. And so the individual participates directly in the internal life of God, even though the experience of the individual is this experience of prosaic oppression and limitation. And then the popular culture offers these fantasies of escape and empowerment, which are some partial fulfillment of this idea of the self as being divine. Then, in the practical arrangements of society, the Americans are tinkerers. There's this vital experimentalism in the United States. The insular knowledge economy is one of its products. But the Americans exempt their institutions from the reach of the experimentalist impulse. So there's a contradiction. Experiment with everything. Experiment with the machines, the gadgets. Don't experiment with the institutions. So there are a series of contradictions in American life. And the American prophets, and every country has its prophets, or must have them, or does have them latently, have at their disposal these contradictions. So we're not going to discuss now what the path to transformation in the United States would be. But it's just to say that I think that these problems we've been discussing are universal problems, and problems from which the United States is not exempt. I was trying to get you to speak to this question of the combination of theoretical and practical ambition, which seems to me to be one of the most forbidding aspects of the kind of argument that I'm making. Yes?
I find the argument really compelling, particularly in the US context, where we really glorify our structures and our Constitution in particular. I'd be curious to hear if you know of any countries where that's not the case and people are less wedded to their structures. Does that exist, or is that universal also?
Well, I think the United States is the extreme of a general tendency in the world. So there's an enormous amount of micro-experimentalism in the world, bubbling up from below in society. It's not harnessed to these large political projects. And then there's this programmatic infusion of how to think about structural alternatives. So, and then there's another feature which deserves attention, which is now that the progressives in the world think that the orthodoxy is neoliberalism, or some version of it, because neoliberalism and social democracy have now converged, and they've merged. We could call that social liberalism. That's the dominant ideology of the elites on both sides of the Atlantic. Huh? Let's combine the social protection of the Europeans with the economic flexibility of the Americans without any drastic institutional change. So that's the dominant view, but the world is restless. And there's this phenomenon that the majority of people in most countries in the world feel dispossessed and frustrated. And they have this aspiration to ascent. That's the people whom I've labeled in this way the subjective petty bourgeoisie. Now, then the progressives think the orthodoxy is universal. That's neoliberalism, the Washington Consensus, the augmented Washington Consensus. The heresies are local. So the heresies are created by the combination of elements of the orthodoxy with local adaptations. So there's the Chinese way, the Indian way, and so forth. This seems to me to be completely implausible. So the 19th century belief, the belief of Karl Marx or John Stuart Mill, was that a universal orthodoxy can be successfully combated only by a universalizing heresy. So there's no way to defeat the universal orthodoxy with these local heresies. So liberalism and socialism in the 19th century were universalizing heresies. They were developed in certain parts of the world, but they were addressed to all of humanity, to the whole world. So the idea was it would take a different form in each country, but it wasn't a message for one country. It was a message for every country. And I think that this argument that I've been trying to have in the semester about the progressive alternative is intended to describe a universalizing heresy. So I stay by this idea, but that only adds to the picture of this excessive ambition. And that seems to me to be a problem. And that's what I'm trying to get some fix on or some reaction to. Because when faced with an obstacle, the impulse is to go one step further up. So more, because this is related to that. So it's not just change in institutions, it's change in consciousness. It's not just political revolution, it's religious revolution. And so more and more and more. So, and then you have to ask, is this a fantasy? Where does this meet back with the world? Because what all the experts say, the technicians, the specialists, and now even philosophy has become one more specialty, is the world is made up of these little problems. And it's different. That's what's in contradiction to the approach that I've been taking here. Yes?
Yeah, I really love the argument. I'm a student at the Kennedy School, and I definitely relate to this. I see this disdain for the imaginative everywhere. I guess one question I have is whether democracy presents an inherent challenge to this sort of thing. I want to believe that it doesn't, but there's something in me that wonders if by trying to experiment and be imaginative, that requires you to be really agile in how you're thinking about different things working, try things that might not work and transition to the things that do work, speak in terms that aren't readily apparently ideological, that don't neatly fit into a left-right dichotomy.
Yes.
And I wonder if people will reject that because it's not quick and easy. It's
So you take the aspect of democracy, right? And this discussion about high energy democracy. So At the beginning of my discussion of democracy, I insisted on this point, that the point of departure was not, I mentioned Benjamin Constant's opposition of the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns. So I'm taking the position of the moderns and not of the ancients. So the idea of the liberty of the ancients was there would be, politics would be the center of life. The selfless citizen would replace the incarnate, interest-bearing individual as the protagonist of history. And this seems to me to be a kind of mythical inversion, like an example of bad utopianism. And it has practical consequences. So in the idea of the left about participatory democracy, for example, what you have are a series of experiments in which you have more and more meetings, more and more participation. The meetings are taken over by a small faction, an elite of talkers, who are these activists. The activists bore everyone else to death, and they create a situation in which what's supposed to be the universal participation is just the manipulation of the group by this self-appointed minority of talkers. So that's an example of the mistakes. So that's not what I imagine. When I describe the root of high-energy democracy, I try to imagine a spectrum of ways of heating democracy up, of increasing its structural fecundity that start from what we have. Changing the character of representative democracy step by step, little by little, rather than replacing representative democracy by direct or participatory democracy. Now that's a special case of a more general pervasive idea in the course, which can be explained by a contrast between these two categories of activities, right? So we have the normal moves that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted. So that's normal life, prosaic life. In science, that's what Thomas Kuhn would call normal science. And then there are the exceptional moves by which from time to time, typically under the pressure of crisis, we change and challenge parts of the framework. And that's this revolutionary, that's revolution. And that's what Kuhn would call revolutionary science, change of the paradigms and so forth. Now, in general, what I've been trying to do in each facet of the argument of the course is not to imagine the suppression of the normal by the revolutionary, but to imagine the gradual expansion of the normal. So that in our ordinary activity, the ordinary business of life, takes on more and more of the attributes of those exceptional activities. So that the exceptional activities cease to be so exceptional. So that the activity of changing the framework, pieces of the framework, arises more naturally and continuously out of the normal activities that we conduct within the framework. That's the difference. And you can understand it again by the analogy with science. So suppose normal science takes on some of the features of this revolutionary paradigm-changing science. That's better. So instead of this contrast between the lonely geniuses and the ordinary scientific drones, ordinary scientific work is enhanced. That's the general description of the goal. But then when we try and place all of those ideas in a framework, as I just did with respect to the theory of regimes, it seems too much. So we need to have a general view, but when you put all of the pieces together, it can seem overwhelming and therefore unrealistic. That's the problem that I was addressing. Yes.
Does thinking about the world through the framework of universal orthodoxies that need to be combated by universal heresies run the risk of overshadowing the particular grievances that particular groups might have? I mean, in some sense, I feel like not everyone would agree that their oppressor is all the same, right? Some people, I think, might say that their problems are particular or little. And I guess what's your response to the risk of perhaps just overshadowing particular struggles?
Well, I mean, among the general ideas I presented were ideas that could serve as the conduit or channel for particular grievances. For example, when I was discussing high energy democracy, the fourth of the 5 sets of innovations that I proposed had to do with the idea of coming to the rescue of a group which finds itself caught in a circumstance of disadvantage from which it is unable to escape by the forms of collective political and economic action available to it. Now, the identity or character of that group may differ widely from one place to another, but the solution seems to me to have some very general character to it, which is, despite the distinctive nature of the grievances. So in other words, these societies in the world are class societies. All of them have these forms of oppression. And in all of them, there may be the need to have some kind of change that is structural but local. And then the problem of imagining a state which is capable of implementing such change that is structural but local is not a local problem. That's a general problem. Even though it's a general problem, even though the general solution would be used to address very different kinds of groups and grievances in different parts of the world. So what I resist is the idea that just because there are local grievances or unique problems, therefore the arrangements, the fundamental arrangements, have to be purely local. The fundamental arrangements can be very similar, even though the problems to which they apply could be very different. Yes?
Another thought on just the from a global perspective, the resistance to the theoretical and practical change. In order to enact that change, you need political will. And I'm curious if you have any reflections on the fact that most politicians, in order to say yes to something that ambitious, would need to relent some aspect of their power. And that's, in my head, not very
No, you have to say a little bit more.
in the sense that, a high energy democracy supposes that we're on board, that we want more people to vote and to vote more frequently, and not everybody in power wants that because
Of
it
course.
could potentially undermine their authority. So how do you square that wide-scale change would require political will that doesn't necessarily want wide-scale change?
Well, but what's the practical implication of the argument? Of course there's resistance.
So I guess
to
that's
all
what,
these kinds of-
I'm wrestling with is how do we overcome that resistance? And I'm wondering if you have a thought on that.
Well, I think that one of the things that's highlighted by these arguments is that political change is not enough if it's not accompanied by change in consciousness, right? So, so like in the United States, there's the politician. And then there's the prophet. And so there's spiritual agitation, religious agitation, and political agitation. They're not coordinated. There isn't the same instruments, but they're both necessary. And how does that happen? How can you have a a political movement that then has implications for consciousness, a movement in consciousness that has implications for the change of the institutions. There are these moments of revival, of enthusiasm in national cultures that then are propitious to this combination. And exceptionally, there can be agents who combine in themselves the character of the politician and of the prophet, like Abraham Lincoln, or like Gandhi in India. This can happen also. But this is not the normal way in which the problem is resolved. The problem is not resolved by having the same individual represent both sides. The problem has to be resolved somehow collectively. Yes.
I just wanted to comment, Professor, on what Hilary said. So in India, we have a similar kind of what do you call it? Not experiment, but it's a revolution which occurred in form of now it is known as Sikhism, but essentially it was political, it was structural, there were land reforms, there was distribution of land. It happened sometime in 14th century, and it was spiritual. So the kind of resurgence that you're talking in all the realms, there are examples and instances, and that was a movement which went on. It was also an anti-caste movement, anti-Varna movement against social hierarchies. So we have those examples in the very recent. And second, I wanted to know I wanted you to elucidate a little more about Hegelian principle and how they go in favor. I mean, like, how do you relate the Hegelian principle with what you were saying in context with Marxism as you are coming on?
That's too high flown, Hegelian principle and so forth. I think that's going to get a tangent. Let me approach the question from a different angle that also addresses the point that you were making back there. So, when politics is ambitious, it naturally has a broader set of implications, right? And it goes beyond the terrain of these practical compromises in society and begins to deal with the form of life. For example, education. Projects of national reform of education are programs of national liberation and have been in modern history in many countries in the world. And they arise in politics, but they involve then a concerted attempt to change the national spirit. And the most important way in which to change the national spirit would be to increase the ambition of ordinary people. So this is why when I said, what's the way of understanding the relation between right and left, with respect to the goal, not with respect to the method. A crucial distinction is whether it's natural for human life to be small. And should an ordinary man or woman think it's natural for their lives to be small, except if there's some national emergency. So politics can be about that. And if there's some principle of national service, for example, that's another practical way to give substance to this idea that life is not small and that everyone will have responsibilities beyond the family. Now, look at it from the angle of religion. So, in the United States, all the institutional arrangements and the civic religion of the country, the cult of the Constitution, have been heavily influenced by an anomalous moment in the development of Christianity, which was what happened in the middle period of the history of Protestantism. So early Protestantism, like Luther and Calvin, had a doctrine for the reorganization of society. Contemporary Protestantism also has a doctrine for the reorganization of society. But in the middle moment, which is the moment of Madison and Schleiermacher and Harnack and so forth, Protestantism became allowed for the privatization of the religion. So the religion is a matter of individual conscience. But the conscience doesn't involve any project for society. That's an anomaly in the history of religion, in the history of Christianity. That only happened then, but it's had this shaping influence in society. So normally what's the case is that a change would begin in politics, but then it would ramify out and influence the spiritual life of society. And a change would begin in religion, and then it would irradiate to the transformation of politics. That's what's normal. That's the normal condition. So what we can't see as being somehow the object of deliberate agency or coordination is to say the politician and the prophet will work as if they were partners. Who arranges that partnership? No one. That happens spontaneously somehow in the life of society. And that's the problem that remains. So each of these two sources of inspiration and resistance develops independently of the other. Each then goes to the terrain of the other, but there's no one standing above them and, as it were, coordinating them. And that's true. That's part of the situation. Yes?
My question is on the United States and the multilateral institutions that it in effect controls. Well, in spirit they're supposed to be multilateral, but in terms of actions, they really aren't. And my question is really towards how it imposes certain action points and narratives on nations of the East, whether it is privatization.
No, you have to speak slower and more loudly, please.
So my question is on United States and the multilateral institutions
Yes.
which it controls.
Like what, for example, the United
like,
Nations
let's say,
system?
For the World Bank or the IMF,
Yeah.
and how they control the economies and the societies and even the politics of many countries. So while in spirit it is supposed to be multilateral, but whenever nations do need help in terms of funding, a set of conditionalities is handed out, and US does play a role in that, which could be anything from privatization to the way the cultural aspects are supposed to be organized or reorganized. And in this case, the institutions, although they may be housed within the United States, the power and influence surmounts a whole broader region. Most often successfully, sometimes not successfully, in which case, because we are not in an insular world, it kind of filters back in terms of other backlashes within the United States.
Yes.
So how do we look at that? For the US, it's a progressive alternative, but I come from India.
What's a progressive alternative?
The alternative of creating these typical structures in other countries which are clones of what it is like in the United States. In terms of perhaps the companies or the way things are organized. But do you think it's a good thing for the other countries of the world to impose these kind of features which are US driven?
To impose them? What do you mean to impose them? You're saying they're imposed on them?
They're imposed on the other countries.
Yes.
Whenever there is a need for funding or wherever there is a need for some sort of bilateral assistance, etc.
And what's the practical conclusion?
The practical conclusion is that it may not always work. It may not always work, but these are things which are, in terms of governance, the US works beyond its borders to impose certain institutions in other countries.
Of course. So the rules-based or the rule-based international order is in part a long arm of the influence of the United States, of the American government. That's obvious, and that's generally recognized in the world. Now, it has to be said that there's a simple solution for the middle-income countries. The simple solution is not to depend on those organizations. So build up your hard currency reserves, build up your domestic saving, have a buffer which allows you to stand up and say no not accept the conditionality. And then what's happened to the Bretton Woods institutions is that the majority of middle-income countries no longer depend on them because they have the internal instruments of independence from them. So then the Bretton Woods organizations are being driven to deal with just the poorest countries. And the poorest countries need their money or need their help, but they have different ways of dismissing them. I mean, if the African countries could kick out the World Bank, they would do it tomorrow. But they still need their money. Now they have some money from China, which they can use as an alternative to the money of the World Bank. I don't think that's the main problem in the world. I think this comes in the category of a secondary annoyance. So if the Bretton Woods institutions are supposed to be the long arm of the attempt of the United States to impose some paradigm of economic policy or institutional organization, the long arm isn't working. We have, in Brazil, we have great problems now, but it's not because of American influence, it's our own doing. We've imposed the chains on ourselves. We're subservient to the local rentiers, not to the American rentiers. And no middle-income country now has an excuse for being on its knees. All it needs to do is develop the instruments to stand up, as they have, the great majority of them. So I don't think that's the problem. The problem is that the rules-based order that we have in the United States, insofar as it depends on the multilateral organization, that's only one of the two elements. Because as I said, there are two elements in this idea of the rule-based order. There's public international common law, and then there are the multilateral organizations. The multilateral organizations don't work. The Bretton Woods organizations have ceased to be needed by every country that's a little developed, middle-income countries, and the United Nations system is totally paralyzed and serves mainly as an umbrella organization for what does work, which are these coalitions, these voluntary coalitions among particular states to deal with issues like the climate issue. That's what does work. But I don't think that's the problem. You seem to think that's a grave problem in the contemporary world. I think it's a problem of diminishing importance. Yes. So I don't want to go on to the other part of my discussion today, which would have been the normative direction. I hope that will come up next week anyway. But I'm troubled by your response because I want more resistance.
We're saving it for the final paper.
You're saving it for the final paper, okay. I guess I'm getting at something which transcends the theoretical argument, which is I'm observing a pre-theoretical psychological tendency in myself, which is when facing this resistance to go up further. As I've described it as doubling the bet. So a larger and larger theoretical project, a larger and larger practical project. So it's different from the strategy of Marxism, right? I just described the psychological characteristic of the Marxist strategy, which saying is, you have an ally. The ally is history. It's a counterpart to the religions, the Semitic monotheisms. They say, we have a friend who's in charge of the universe and who will deliver us eternal life. And so Marxism say, you have a friend, your friend is history. And there's this project. I don't think I have these friends. So I don't have that problem, but I have another problem, which is then I'm responding to this set of constraints by the expansion of the project. And it seems that it creates the risk of endangering more and more my connection to what my contemporaries believe is accessible and feasible. That's what I'm calling the dynamic of doubling the bet. And so I don't, yes.
At the end of every class or semester, do you double your bet? What have you seen?
What do you mean at the end?
By the interactions that you have with Arvind and then your own thinking process, by the end of each semester, are you doubling your...
You mean from one year to the
expansion?
other? Has it been getting worse?
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess I have a reason not to contemplate it because it would be too disturbing, but no, I don't know that it's been getting worse, but it's bad enough. I guess that's the answer. Okay, so we'll reconvene next week. Please come equipped with your questions inspired by your papers.
Well, somebody did machines in their home. Huge. Yeah, that's huge.
Well, I'm like,
On a
like,
alternative project.
quarters in-house.
You are on a different alternative project.
Pre-theoretical psychology.
Us?
The pre-theoretical psychology.
Imaginative mode for us.
I don't know what it means, but it sounds really cool. Also, my
Are you going to HKS?
I don't know what it means.
You have the class. Naam to batao, tell me. Quarters.
And all of them are like, there's a shortage,
Follows this class?
$10.
Oh.
The goddamn app. You can pay credit card there too.
Pretty sure that's the first time I ever saw it. Because it's not like a modern fancy machine.
It's like 10 days.
There is a vision about what the expectation is for.
I have time to do everything.
Got it?
Sorry, what did you say?
Huh?
Probably the best
Gosh, she's coming back.
you're also like organizing. I think it would be like a full-time job to be on top of things.
I literally put my job finding project and everything on the standstill. And I'm spent 2 weeks on
Are
that.
you going to be so
At least for a year.
Wow.
Thanks for doing it.
No, I'm trying to convince all of you.
At least for a year, my OPT.
Oh, how did it go? How did it go?
We went to a professor.
Oh, that's great.
It was both the professors didn't want to move at all and neither the students. Beyond time. Yes, it's beyond time and neither of them.
Wow. It was their each other?
Yeah. And quite a few students were turned up. Like 20 plus.
I've been like silently panicking and not like, funniest thing I've ever heard.
What's that?
In the water. How could this happen?
And it's evening and it is in
No, they're
Lewis.
trying
Is
to
it Lewis
smart.
Yeah, so we have
Which I don't, I'm low-key panicking. I'm like, well, what if you
No,
don't
I
get
take
it
it.
fast?
Really? They get.
I think so.
within this range, we have to without justification and just commit to it. And then, we need like an institutional arrangement that is compatible with this reality of pluralism. Exactly, I don't know, the Rawls from 50 years ago.
But it seems like Rawls is, tell me where I'm wrong, because I know you know a lot more about this. So it seems like Rawls is saying the one vision that we should commit to is like the distributive justice behind a veil of ignorance. It seems to me like he's like, don't commit to one vision yet, like have this explosion of different ideas and arrangements, and then eventually we might narrow it down.
Yeah, like these things sound kind of different, but are they different? Like,
It seems like Rawls has an idea of what we should land on.
I mean, it is supposed to be a thing that,
Well, I guess now, yeah, because it's distributive justice, and it's like, okay, what are the institutional arrangements to get us there? And Rawls doesn't pretend to have one.
yeah, like you have like just
I guess
two,
it is kind
I
of
mean,
the same.
even the Rawls from 1970 have like two principles of justice that are super broad. Like, you don't need a vision of what human welfare looks like to commit to that.
Yeah.
Like, you just think that everybody is equal in the sense that their capacity to choose what's good is
And this
worth
is what
the
he's saying,
same.
deep equality,
Yeah,
deep freedom.
yeah, and so it just sounds like the same thing. And yet, it seems like when he is giving political philosophy shit, it's just Rawls that he's thinking about. So he's at the same time giving the men some shit and just copying his own work.
Yeah. I mean, well, before I understood his argument, it seems like a lot of it is maybe